Good morning. This is 7th grade social studies and I'm Dina Vandenbosch. So let's learn some geography. Last week we were on Geography Standard 1.5, which is categorizing the graphic organization of people, places, and environments on Earth. We'll stick with that this week. But first let's play our Where in the World segment. And this week's segment comes from Connor, who's a 7th grader at Clark Shaw Magnet School. And clue number 1, remember the idea here is to try to guess the location in as few clues as possible. So clue number 1, Connor says it's in the Eastern Hemisphere. So what does that mean for us? We know that the prime meridian is the dividing line for longitude. It's our main line of longitude at 0 degrees. So to say we're in the Eastern Hemisphere means we're going to be east of that line. So that runs from here all the way down, anything up into 180 degrees. All right, clue number 2. Clue number 2 says it's located at 30 degrees latitude. Well, that could mean two different things. That could be 30 degrees north, or it could be 30 degrees south. We haven't said yet. Clue number 3. Clue number 3 says that this is the birthplace of Elon Musk, from the CEO of Tesla. So for you trivia fans out there, you may know something about that. If not, let's go to clue number 4. Clue number 4 said Nelson Mandela was selected or elected its president in 1994. So have you guessed the location? This is a country, and the country is South Africa. So South Africa is the most industrialized country in Africa. It is abundant in mineral wealth, gold, diamonds, coal. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in South Africa for 27 years of his life, but was released and became its first democratically elected president, ending apartheid, which was a very strict way of life in South Africa of segregation of races. So have you gotten whiplash yet? We've gone from Russia last week to now we're in Africa. So that's today's objective. We're going to examine the geography of the region Sub-Saharan Africa. And our essential question is, how have instances of human environmental interaction impacted the physical environment? And we're going to see many examples of that in Sub-Saharan Africa. But I can already hear the first question. Your first question is, what is Sub-Saharan Africa? I know what Africa is. What's Sub-Saharan? Why do you keep saying that? Well, the answer is the prefix sub means below. It's a Latin word for below or under. So literally we're saying under the Sahara Desert. But in geography sense, that means south, okay? So the Sahara Desert is in the very north of Africa. So we're talking about any country that is below that line, okay? And your next question probably is, well, why are you leaving out North Africa? What's wrong with those countries? Well, there's nothing wrong with them, but the quick answer is they have more in common with what we're going to study next week, the countries of Southwest Asia. So we're going to kind of treat them as a separate region. Remember, regions are a way of looking at commonalities between countries, and North Africa has little in common really with the rest of Africa. So let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa by itself. But let's take some quick facts of Africa. Let's see what you know. Africa is the continent with the most number of countries. There are 54 countries in Africa, the most in any continent in the world. It's also our second most populated continent, right behind what? Can you guess? Asia, okay? Asia is going to have the most with the two countries, China with 1.3 billion people and India with 1.1 billion people. Next, this is the world's largest hot desert, the Sahara Desert. Now, why did I just say hot? Well, technically, Antarctica is the world's largest desert. Deserts are measured by lack of rainfall, but most people, when they think of a desert, they think of a hot place. It also has the world's second largest rainforest, the Congo. And what was the world's largest rainforest? In the Amazon. Exactly right. Africa is known for its vast grasslands. These are called savannas, and they make up about 60% of Africa. And finally, this is where you're going to find the world's most megafauna. And megafauna, I've learned, means large animals. So that's probably what you think of when you think of the large animals grazing on the savanna. So what are some notable things about Sub-Saharan Africa? I put this question to my students. So let's hear a few responses. Jemiah said, lions, elephants, grasslands come to mind. And, of course, the Lion King movie. A couple of other students were thinking about movies. They thought of the Black Panther, Carlos and Razine. Deja, Isaac, and Reagan were all thinking of animals and wildlife, the lions, savannas, and safaris. Many of you said the deserts and how it's really hot in some parts of Africa. But Christia, Jerusha, and Jackson, you mentioned the diverse and interesting cultures that are found in Africa, the many languages and people, from small villages to big cities, and the beautiful places that people may not think of. Mackenzie and Zion, I think you were thinking of water scarcity and how some people have to maybe walk miles to get to a clean water source. Kevin mentioned the lack of food and widespread hunger in some places. Josiah mentioned struggling economies. Carson mentioned poverty. Olivia mentioned, though, that it's a resource-rich continent. William talked about European colonization. And then Jaden talked about the many diverse cultures that are found in Africa. He mentioned that in northern Africa, most of the people belong to the Islamic religion, while in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a mix of religions, Christianity and local religions. And then Collins mentioned the Uganda Little League baseball team comes to mind because they played in their first Little League World Series a few years ago, and I remember that. And then I'll sum it up with Jaden says it is a beautiful place. So I agree with all of that. Let's take a look at the physical map of sub-Saharan Africa. We always want to see what's going on there. So let's look at the latitude and longitude. First of all, Africa has the equator running right through it. Okay, this is our 0 degrees line of latitude. And also the prime meridian runs through the western part of Africa. There are some major bodies of water. Africa is bordered on the west by the Atlantic Ocean, by the east, Indian Ocean. To its north is the Mediterranean Sea. We also have the Red Sea to its northeast. The Nile River runs through many countries in Africa and empties into the Mediterranean Ocean there in Egypt. And also Lake Victoria is found in eastern Africa. And some major landforms to know about. We've already mentioned that in the north there's the Sahara Desert. We also have the Congo rainforest in the mid-central Africa. Also the Great Rift Valley, which is an area that has been affected by plate tectonics. And there you're going to find lakes and rivers and volcanoes. In the south, you've got the Kalahari Desert and the Namib Desert. And let's not forget Madagascar. Many of you probably knew that that was a real place, not just a movie that you've seen. Now I'm switching to a population density map. Last week we looked at one of these when we were in the region of Russia and the Eurasian republics. Now let's take a look at what this looks like from sub-Saharan Africa. And this is showing the Eastern Hemisphere, showing Europe, Africa. But let's zero in on Africa here. What conclusions can you draw about this? Remember, on a population density map, each little red dot represents 50,000 or more people. So notice where you see the concentrations of red color. And where you see that, let's think about how our knowledge of Africa's physical geography helps explain what we're seeing here. So what do you see? Well, hopefully, some of the takeaways that you have is that you've noticed that there are wide swaths of land that have very little red. And what does that mean? Well, that's going to mean low population density. It doesn't mean that there's no one living there, just very small concentration of people and no large cities. Also, a physical map will show us that what is in that blank area. Well, that's the Sahara Desert. What's down here? The Kalahari Desert, the Namib Desert. Does that make sense to you? We probably wouldn't expect to find large numbers of people in those places. And a final takeaway, look at the areas with the darkest red. Where do you see those? So let's take a look. Around here, here, that little squiggle is the Nile River, around here. So what do you notice? They're all around rivers, lakes, and the coast. Does that make sense? What do they have in common? Water. So what's the big idea? Let's compare this maybe to what we learned from last week's population density map. Remember the map of Russia with Siberia, and you saw very little red show up in Siberia. What's in common with this map? I think the big idea here is that climate, land cover, access to water, and arable land where you can grow crops all affect where human settlements want to be created. Most people do not want to live in places that are inhospitable to their survival. Switching now to a political map, as we said, there are 54 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's talk about them as regions. There's a Northern Africa, which we're going to look at next week when we talk about Southwest Asia. But for today, we're going to concentrate on those areas south of the Saharan Desert. So we've got Western Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa. So let's zoom in and see what the countries are there. And I promise you I'm going to pronounce these 100% correctly. So let's start first with West Africa. In West Africa, Western Sahara is actually a disputed territory. That's why I put a little asterisk there. It would like to think of itself as independent, but it's actually claimed by Morocco. Next we have Cape Verde. These are some islands off the coast. Next we have Mauritania, and I'm going to continue around in this motion. Senegal on the west coast. Gambia is a country that is shaped like a little snake in the middle of Senegal. The next is Guinea-Bissau, and then Guinea. Next we have Sierra Leone and Liberia. The next country has a French name. It's pronounced Côte d'Ivoire, but we would say it in English as the Ivory Coast. Next to the Ivory Coast is Ghana. Then we have Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Nigeria is actually the most populated country in Africa. And let's go back up here to just south of the Sahara Desert. We have Mali. Burkina Faso is right beneath it. And then we have Niger. And finally, Chad. So those are the countries of Western Africa. Let's move over to East Africa. This is sometimes called the Horn of Africa. Do you see that horn shape there? Some people liken it to the horn of a rhinoceros. We'll start first with Sudan, and then South Sudan. Next to it is Eritrea on the Red Sea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and I know that some of you are giggling right now. That's always a favorite for some of my students. Say it with me, Djibouti. Then we've got Somalia, the Horn of Africa there, and Somaliland. Remember I said the asterisk means what? It's a disputed territory. So Somaliland would like to think of itself as independent, but Somalia claims it. Next to that we have Kenya, Uganda, here next to Lake Victoria, Rwanda, Burundi, two small nations here, and finally Tanzania. So that's East Africa. Let's move to Central Africa. Here we have Cameroon, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Then we have Congo, two separate nations, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea. And you can probably guess why it's called Equatorial Guinea. The equator runs right through there. And then off to the coast, we have some islands called Sao Tome and Principe. And then finally, Southern Africa. And I say Southern and not South Africa because we know that there is a country named South Africa. So Southern is more reflective of the region. So in Southern Africa, we have Angola, which is the largest country in Southern Africa, Zambia next to it, Malawi, Mozambique on the coast, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and then finally South Africa. And then look into South Africa and you're going to see two small countries that are inside there. We call these enclaves, a country that's entirely surrounded by another country. Those two enclaves are Lesotho and then Swaziland, which has recently changed its names to Eswatini. And then finally, let's not forget Madagascar. Now, I may have missed a few countries that are small island countries. I'll leave that up to you to find those. Let's do some visual vocabulary now. Savannas, you're going to see these throughout Africa. These are those tropical grasslands. 60% of Africa is covered with there. Here's the Serengeti Plain, which is home to many grazing and migrating animals. Also, ecotourism is something that we've seen before, and you're going to see this in Africa as well. This is called tourism, okay, you see the word tourism, in natural environments that is meant to preserve the ecosystem, okay? It's meant to boost the economy but also promote sustainability. The word poaching. Poaching is the illegal hunting of animals. It threatens species. An example that is pictured here is the ivory trade, which is a worldwide thing, unfortunately, and sometimes that money goes to funding terrorist groups. Desertification is a big part of what's happening in Africa. This word, desertification, means the process of becoming a desert. If you look at the picture, you'll see desert in the background and you see trees and shrubs, but it looks like the sand is taking over. Unfortunately, this is like the gradual creeping of the desert. And what that does is it takes away the fertile land and results in less land to grow food. And it's due to a lot of things: climate, drought, overpopulation, overgrazing, land management practices. So desertification is a big issue, especially around the Sahara Desert. A transition zone is related to that. A transition zone is any area between two geographical regions that has characteristics of both. So an example of this is Africa's Sahel region. And this is a region that is just south of the Sahara Desert. If you notice in the picture, you've got what looks like a desert on the right, on the left, and then you've got savannas to the right, but it looks like the desert's kind of creeping up on them. Deforestation is another issue in Africa. We've looked at that in South America. They have the same issue here, but maybe due to different things. This is the wide-scale destruction of trees. And in Africa, the growing population is partly due to this. Increase in farming, and a big thing is using wood as fuel for cooking and heating. That's probably the #1 reason for its use in Africa. There's also deforestation due to commercial logging and commercial agriculture for growing cash crops. Subsistence farmers. Remember what that definition is. That's farming to keep your family alive, raising livestock to provide for your basic needs. This is small scale, it's not commercial, and you have typically very little left over to sell or to trade. So that's the type of farming you see widely in Africa. And one of those techniques, unfortunately, is called slash and burn farming. This is a method of clearing the land by chopping down the vegetation and trees and then burning them. Unfortunately, what that leads to is deforestation, soil erosion, nutrient loss, and other things that damage the biodiversity of sub-Saharan Africa. A big challenge in sub-Saharan Africa is our water scarcity, shortage of clean water, and that is a big challenge for the farmers there. Due to a lot of things: climate variability, growing population, increased need for water, lack of infrastructure. In fact, 40% of the world's water-stressed people live in sub-Saharan Africa. So, I think we've talked a few times about human-environmental interaction, specific activities by humans that are impacting the physical environment across sub-Saharan Africa. Can you think of some of those things that we've mentioned already? So far, we've talked about increasing population. Africa has the highest population growth of any continent. Farming, hunting have had significant impacts, such as habitat destruction, overgrazing, soil degradation, desertification, erosion, water scarcity, clearing of forests. All of those are ways that activities by humans are impacting the physical environment in sub-Saharan Africa. And you really see this with this picture. I wanted to zoom this in, of desertification. This is in the Sahel region. Again, those countries that border the Saharan Desert. This is Mali, and you can really get a sense as to, we've got the desert on the left, and it's just encroaching on the savannas to the right here in the picture. So what are some of those reasons for desertification? Let's talk about cause and effect, just to hammer this issue home. Some of the causes of desertification: drought, lack of rainfall, climate variability, long periods of time between normal rainfall, overgrazing by animals. When you allow your animals to graze on what shrubs and vegetation there is, it actually, if you do that too much, it depletes that growth. Population growth that's putting a strain on these resources and land practices. Here you actually have, you can see methods of trying to contain the desert by building little walls and fences. So what are the effects of this? Well, again, we've said less fertile soil. That less fertile soil leads to loss of farmland, loss of grazing locations, and then that leads to an inadequate food supply. Unfortunately, the effect of that is hunger, malnutrition, poverty, and conflict over resources. This is a table that shows some of those impacts of changes in land, and you can look at desertification, deforestation, and soil erosion. They have impacts that reach in many different areas. The environment, they have human health implications, safety issues, and also it impacts politics and economics. One of the ways it's impacting sub-Saharan Africa is with malnourishment, undernourishment. And that is a problem around the world, a chronic condition impacting entire countries and regions, and it's becoming increasingly important as our world population grows. It can be impacted by a lot of different things in physical geography. And if you look at this world map of undernourishment, you'll see that a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa deal with this issue. Yet, there are many resources in sub-Saharan Africa. This resource map shows you just the number of the variety of natural resources from aluminum, coal, diamonds, and gold. So what explains why haven't African nations benefited more from this mineral wealth? Well, the short answer, there's been a history of exploitation. The Atlantic slave trade decimated regions of Western Africa. European colonization, the scramble to take Africa for themselves, political conflict and corrupt governments, ethnic violence and civil war instability due to borders that European colonists drew. There's a whole wealth of reasons, and you're going to learn about that in 9th grade world history. So let's kind of review a few things that we've talked about. Let's do a couple of review questions. The African countries in the Sahel region, just south of the Sahara Desert, are experiencing what as grasslands are lost due to drought and overgrazing? Lack of rainfall, desertification, overgrazing, deforestation, or poaching. What's the best term that goes in there? They are experiencing desertification. Next, Serengeti National Park in Tanzania is a popular place for these people who travel to other countries to experience their natural wonders. And the best answer for that, is it poachers, ecotourists, science, biologists, or subsistence farmers? And the best answer is ecotourists. Which of the following regions is the best example of a transition zone? The Sahara Desert in North Africa, the Congo rainforest in Central Africa, the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, the Sahel just south of the Saharan Desert, or the Kalahari Desert. And a transition zone is when you have mixtures of two different zones. So we can rule out the Sahara Desert and the Kalahari Desert, and the best one is going to be the Sahel, that on the borderland of the Sahara Desert. And then finally, which is the following is a leading cause of deforestation in sub-Saharan Africa? Commercial logging, large-scale commercial farming, the use of wood as a fuel source, clearing land to build roads and bridges, or is it clearing land to mine the resources? And if you were listening carefully, you'll know that the answer was the use of wood as a fuel source. At this time, I want you to take a look at these words that are on the screen, and I want you to think about how you could use them in a Take 5 summary. You're going to take 5 of these words and you're going to use them in a concise summary that shows that you have an understanding of human-environmental interaction. Well, it looks like that's all the time we have for this week. Next week, we're going to look at North Africa and Southwest Asia, and we're going to answer the question, what is the Middle East, and just exactly where is that? Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next Wednesday.